Joanna wept quietly to herself as she and the other women made their way to the tomb. They had been that way just a few days before. Watched them put their Lord on the cross, watched him die there, watched them take his lifeless body, and followed them as they brought it to the grave. Now they retraced their steps in a very different way. When they had returned from the grave, the first time they were weeping and wailing. It was loud, it was boisterous, it was pain because of the grief that was outward and explicit in their hearts and on their lips. What will we do without him? How could they not understand who he was? This time the words had been spoken, the cries had been offered. Now there was nothing left to say. And Joanna, a few tears left, made her way to the tomb. She felt at least comforted in a sense, because this was a way that she could do something, she could serve. It wasn't as though she felt a joy in her heart by any means, but she felt that maybe some of her pain was just a little bit taken away simply because she was able to do an act. She had always been a servant, always done things for other people. Even when she was a child, she had helped all the other kids, kind of taken care of them, kind of mothered them a little bit when they needed a little bit of help. And then as she started to get a little bit older, she took care of the older folks in her own family, cared for them, cared for their needs, nursed them, made sure they were okay. And now she and the other women were able to serve their Lord one more time. They carried the spices, they carried the fragrant oils to anoint his body like their mothers had before them and their mothers had before them. As Joanna wiped her tears, she came close to where she remembered the tomb, but something seemed not quite right. Antonio was a servant too. He had always wanted to be a priest. He had always wanted to care for others in this way. He was born in Vienna in the 1600s, and out of his yearning to care for others and to serve others, he chose to become a priest. When he was 15 years old, he began studying for the priesthood. He studied for a full decade, 10 years, to learn how to become a priest. And then when he was 25, he became ordained as a priest and was able to do the service that he had always dreamed about. They called him the Red Priest because of his red hair and because he had always wanted to be a servant in this way. And now he was assigned, his task was to be at an orphanage, a home for abandoned children, the Hospital de la Pieta. At the Pieta, he was able to care for those in need and serve communion. He was able to serve the Eucharist and be exactly what he wanted to be, a priest, observing the Mass for the people. Unfortunately, however, his ability to do so was short-lived. You see, Antonio had a condition, and probably we would call it asthma today, or some kind of asthmatic condition, and they call it shortness of breath. He simply wasn't able to speak for long periods of time. He literally could not speak his way through the Mass. He could not do what he had dreamed of doing. He could not serve in the way he wanted to. And so he was given a medical discharge as he and his supervisors understood that he simply could not serve in the way that he had always hoped to. The Red Priest was a priest no more. Pretty quickly, Joanna and the other women realized they would not be serving in the way that they thought they had come to the tomb to serve, because there was no body, there was nobody there. Instead, there was a man who proclaimed to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is risen. Do you not remember the times he told you? He taught you this. He told you this was coming." And the women looked at each other in astonishment and in joy. Indeed, he is alive. And pretty quickly, things started to change in Joanna's heart. She had come to the tomb as a servant, but she left as a proclaimer. She had a proclamation now in her heart. Of course, it was Jesus who was raised on that day, but there was something that had come alive in her as well. Something that spilled out of her. She and the other women raced away from the tomb to tell the story. They went first to the disciples to tell them what had happened. Everything that Jesus said has come true, and he is gone. The tomb is empty. Of course, the disciples didn't believe. They called it an idle tale. Oh, the women don't know what they're talking about. Eventually, they continued to tell the story and got them to go to see for themselves. Yes, the tomb is empty. But Joanna didn't stop there. She continued to tell the story. She continued to run through the streets to tell anybody and everybody, he is alive, he is risen. And then she wouldn't stop telling the story even then. She had a new heart in her. Now she was Joanna the proclaimer. She was one of the first preachers to proclaim the good news of the gospel, that Christ is alive. And she continued that ministry. A lot of scholars believe that Joanna is the same as Junia, listed in the book of in the Bible as Paul's one of his main servants, one of the leaders in the church, one of the earliest preachers to preach the gospel again and again and again. She became, because of that resurrection story in her heart, she became one of the most important leaders in the early church. She had a story to tell. She had an Easter song to sing, and it spilled out of her, and she could not contain it anymore. In the same way, Antonio did not stay too long in his grief. You see, Antonio was disappointed about his inability to serve in the way that he felt called, his inability to serve the Mass. However, he had other gifts as well, including being a pretty good musician. And so he took that gift and began to develop it. He continued serving there at the Pieta, at this children's home. The children would have these choirs together, had an incredible music program. They would grow up learning music. And so over time, Antonio became their choir director, became the one who led them in their singing and in their music. In fact, he composed many of the pieces that they sang together. He stayed there for the next 30 years and wrote over 60 pieces specifically for these choirs at the Pieta. But as he wrote, he got the attention not only of those there in that community, not only there in the home, but all around the world. They noticed Antonio's music and noticed that it was exquisite, that it was powerful, that it was emotional. And so he continued to write more and more further, and further became more and more well-known for his writings. In fact, he wrote over 90 sonatas, 46 operas, 500 cantatas, and volumes and volumes and volumes of works about faith, about his resurrection story, about the Easter song that was in his heart. The Red Priest didn't stop creating music. He had a song in his heart, and he had to share it. It spilled over. And so throughout the land, they sang his songs. They worshiped God. They knew of the faith because of the Red Priest. Now, perhaps many of you have figured out by now that Antonio is Antonio Vivaldi, the author of the piece that we will hear in just a moment. The Gloria was one of many pieces that spilled out of his heart because of his faith, because of his love for Christ, because of his Easter song. And so as we hear today, you're invited. You're invited to hear Antonio's sermon. Antonio's Easter song, you're invited to hear and ask yourself, how indeed might you sing your song? How indeed do you have a resurrection story to tell? What is it in your heart that is spilling over to tell about the way that God has changed you? Antonio became a proclaimer. Perhaps we might proclaim that good news as well. Let us now be moved and inspired by Antonio's sermon today. Vivaldi's Gloria.
Laudamus Te, benedicimus Te, adoramus Te, glorificamus Te. Adoramus Te, adoramus Te, glorificamus Te. Laudamus Te, benedicimus Te, adoramus Te, glorificamus Te, adoramus Te, adoramus Te. Laudamus Te. Laudamus Te. Misery.